Our first speaker is Dieter Müller, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Professor from Umeå University, Sweden. And he will speak with us about producing and consuming tourism in Arctic peripheries, some thoughts on contested phenomena. So please, Dieter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to get the screen sharing on so that you all can see what I see, hopefully, after a while. And do you see the right slide? Or
it's the one where we can see your slides as well, rather than
okay,
the full one.
Then we change to the... So
yeah.
Now you should see the right one.
That's right.
Yep. Let's start with my personal point of departure. A couple of years ago, I did a book together with Arvid Viken at the University of Tromsø, or the UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. That's the correct term. And it's on tourism and indigeneity in the Arctic. And actually, when we started with this book, we had kind of a lot of discussions on whether we really should do the book or not. Because we were kind of really thinking, is it reasonable to write a book about a phenomenon that in a way essentializes indigenous people, make them different from the rest of us, so to say. And we were discussing this back and forward, and Arvid always argued, I mean, is it really reasonable to focus on the 0.5% or whatever that kind of distinguishes the Sami people from the non-Sami people? Or should we actually leave it aside? We decided to go for the book, and one reason was simply because the phenomenon is there. But anyhow, it makes me wonder quite a lot about these kind of issues of ethics and what is right and wrong in kind of Arctic tourism. And it's always, of course, negotiated and contested. I mean, there is no right and wrong, but it's always a question about how we discuss it and how we negotiate about it. And I also think there's always a geographical dimension to this question, what is right and wrong in Arctic tourism, meaning that not everybody will agree, and obviously people in different places within the Arctic, outside the Arctic, in Europe, in North America, will have different ideas simply because of our ideas being framed in this kind of historical context that we are kind of grown up into. Of course, I mean, if you wonder what is right and wrong, you could always turn to the human rights as kind of a general and universal kind of idea about how we should treat each other. However, the human rights are not really, in a way, uncontested themselves, because they are kind of have this idea of universalism. And some people would argue, I mean, there should be cultural relativism, and universalism and the human rights are actually in itself an imperial kind of undertaking, kind of a disseminating idea that has been grown out of the Western world onto the entire globe. So there is a debate about that. I personally feel still very much related to the human rights and this idea of universalism. And I think it's the way I see the world, at least. And it's also then in this context about individualism versus collectivism. To what extent we should see individuals rather than collectives. And to a certain extent, you could argue that the human rights in themselves see people as individuals to a high degree. From that point of view, for instance, when we talk about decolonizing the Arctic, from my perspective, this often implies as well that we should see individuals rather than groups. Moving on, I mean, if we talk then about these kind of issues, it's obviously so that there is always conflicts and there are dilemmas related to what is right and wrong in tourism development. Debate over such a development is always unavoidable, and to a certain extent it's sound. It's sound that we talk about how we would like the world to develop and how we would like tourism to develop. And of course, I mean, these conflicting interests are to a certain extent also based on very diverging visions for the future. To be honest, we are about how the future should look like. That is why we have political elections and discourses. So it's nothing strange about that. And tourism is, from that point of view, also inherently a political dimension, or it's the political phenomenon. We have different ideas about how it should develop. Obviously, if we talk about tourism in the Arctic, there is always also a power issue involved, because we are in a core periphery context. And the question is to what tourism development in the north is actually also governed by the people in the north, or to what extent it's actually just a reaction on decision-making elsewhere in southern states or on a global market. This also raises, to a certain extent, then the question of legitimate stakeholders. Who is a legitimate stakeholder for saying what is right and wrong in Arctic tourism? This may seem as a kind of a simple question. You may say, oh, it's probably the inhabitants of the north. Yeah, but who is an inhabitant of the north? I mean, in a mobile society, in an increasingly global and globalized and mobile world, we are obviously kind of living in between or through multiple places. And so even this kind of demarcation of the north is, to a certain extent, a very tricky issue. And so the question, who is deciding on how northern tourism should develop, is not an easy one. And it certainly requires, as I started here, debate over development, and this is sound. And as I said, I mean, you could argue from the first point, or from the onset in a way, that maybe tourism development in the north is not, after all, a smart idea anyhow. Because from an environmental point of view, we could argue that developing tourism in the north is not really a good idea, because people have to usually travel quite a long way in order to experience the northern products. And as we know, climate change and environmental degradation usually would require that we kind of limit our own consumption, maybe fly a little bit less or not at all, and in general kind of think of how we deal with this. Obviously, this is not something that most tourism entrepreneurs in the north would embrace as an idea, because I mean, tourism is also a livelihood and a tool for development in the north, and particularly also a tool for being able to make a living in the north. So we have here these kind of dilemmas and conflicts and conflicting kind of targets that we have to relate to. And I mean, my take on this is also that we need to see tourism as part of a total consumption. I mean, often we kind of just put out tourism consumption and say it's bad. Yes, but at the end of the day, all consumption is bad in that sense that it leaves some kind of environmental traces. But we have to see it in the total portfolio of our consumption, and also look at what would be the alternative use of resources if we don't use them for tourism. So the ethical question is actually more complex than it may occur on the first look, because it's also a question of perspective. Another ethical dimension or other ethical dilemma that I would like to highlight is this question about mass tourism versus individual tourism, or simply the question to what extent scope or size of tourist streams matter. As I said already, I mean, tourism in peripheries is not necessarily a good idea per se, because it obviously requires quite a lot of transportation. And then the question is then, of course, how should we develop tourism in the north? Kind of a small number of tourists, or should we actually look at a broad accessibility that also enables people maybe with less money to experience northern environments and cultures? Obviously, this kind of question and the answer to the question will kind of trigger different kind of impacts on the local economy and the community. Exclusiveness will obviously maybe not leave as many traces, neither or environmentally or culturally. But on the other hand, I mean, it also does not leave a lot of traces economically, with the exception for the few people who are involved in that kind of products. Mass tourism, on the other hand, will probably supply, to a certain extent, greater amount of employment opportunities and income to local businesses. So once again, it's tricky, and each choice will have pros and cons in relation to what is right and wrong in tourism. And the answer is not a given one. And also the impacts of choosing the one or the other will have bearings outside the tourism industry. And that, I think, is also an important thing. If we see tourism as a part of an overall social and societal development, a community development, of course, we also should think about how tourism actually benefits the provision of other kinds of infrastructure, healthcare, transportation, and so on and so on. Because, I mean, having tourism obviously also allows, and transportation owed to tourism obviously allows also locals to travel for other purposes than pure touristic ones. So there are a lot of these kind of connections that make it really tricky to say very clearly what is right and wrong. I personally am currently very much taken by what I call the Arctification of northern tourism, meaning that in a European north, at least, I mean, we have suddenly kind of started to brand the region as the Arctic. And obviously an idea with the Arctic is that it's wilderness, it's a wilderness area. And we see that the attention, I think, for the North is also actually created a little bit by climate change. You know, climate change makes that the Arctic is in the media, is in the news, and it creates to some extent attention for Arctic issues. And I mean, some Canadian colleagues would talk about last chance tourism. There is a global demand, as we see in the north of Sweden, for instance, with increasingly people from all over the world traveling there. It's about economic opportunities, but it's also about economic dependencies. Who owns actually Arctic tourism? I think is also a very important question from an ethical point of view. Who is the benefiter of Arctic tourism? Is there only some small, maybe almost precarious or seasonal employment there for local people? And a lot of the actual revenue is going elsewhere in the world to big companies? Or is it actually really for the benefit of local communities so that they can invest into community development in different ways? So once again, it's not an easy question. It's actually a very complex question, and there are no easy answers, particularly since there is no tourism option. Tourism will always occur because, as we define tourism usually, it does not only contain hedonistic kind of travel for leisure purposes, but it's very much also about VFR tourism. As you probably realized by my name, I'm German by birth, so a lot of my family is in Germany. If I take a flight from Stockholm to Frankfurt, I would usually realize that very few of the people in this airplane are actually tourists in a traditional sense. A lot of them are actually friends and relatives, visitors that are going back and home to their families. So this is also a part of tourism, and from that point of view there is no tourism option really. The pandemic situation offers obviously this kind of counter scenario of almost no tourism option, even though that can be discussed as well. But we could of course then ask ourselves, who suffers from a no tourism option? It was certainly also peripheral places that were suddenly cut off from various kinds of supplies, not only tourism supplies, but also once again supplies that affected other parts of a societal life in the north, for instance. The answer to the question what is right and wrong in northern tourism is certainly also dependent on local and regional preconditions. I would not dare to say what is applicable in the north of Sweden would be applicable in the north of Canada, and probably vice versa. It's also dependent on individual agency, what people want and how they kind of would like to perform certain things. I think an important assignment for us as tourism researchers, but also for all kinds of other stakeholders with an interest in tourism, is I think that tourism should be seen as a part of overall societal development. It's not an end in itself. It's rather an end to other societal development, creating employment or other kinds of desirable impacts on a local community. But on the other hand, of course, also we should always be aware that tourism is a resource use, kind of destroying more or less the limited resources that we have as human beings. And in the end of the day, I think dialogue is the solution. We need to discuss this issue, but we cannot really expect that there will be a final answer. What is right and wrong in Arctic tourism will be always kind of an object for negotiations. Thank you very much.